All right, let's get back to this then. All right, so the topic of the first debate is what moral or ethical obligation fans have when you're watching sport. So what type of issues should you pay attention to? Is there a line that a league or sport could cross where fans should actually take an action? What action would that be? How should fans respond? And remember, to do well in the debate, what I'm looking for is that you work with your team, but importantly, you need to draw on the foundational ideas from earlier in the semester. So in this case, it's deep play, dramaturgical model, sport space, our discussions of how politicians and governments use sports. That's the idea of the sacred divide and the idea of sports washing. So that's what you're going to be doing. So next week on Monday, you should come in ready to start talking to your group. That doesn't mean you've done a lot of outside research. It means you're just started to think about this topic. You've taken a look at the folder that I have on Brightspace that has a bunch of readings and links. You don't need to do all the readings. Just come ready to start talking to your group. So Monday I'll finish up this lecture, and then you'll probably have like 30 minutes to work with your group and divide up the work and figure out exactly what you want to do. Then you'll do some research before Wednesday because there's no required readings. Then you do some research before Wednesday. You come in ready to meet with your group again. On Wednesday, I'll randomly choose which groups are actually in the debate. So you'll find out on Wednesday if you're actually going, and then Friday is the debate. So that's the plan. Every time we have a debate, you've got 2 days leading up to it, and then you have the actual thing occur. So anyone have any questions about that?
Will everyone eventually do a debate?
Every team goes once. So how it works is there's 6 teams. That means 3 debates. Each team competes against another team once. And then when you're not going, your team still has to submit notes, right? So you still have to show what you would have done if you were in the debate, but you don't have a responsibility to actually do it. Other questions about it? And the way I handle it, I've brought this up before. When I was in college, I didn't always like group work because inevitably someone does more work than someone else. That's not always a fair thing. I know that can be frustrating. So A, that's part of the challenge, is learning how to work with others. But B, each of you submit your notes on the document. As a team, you get to choose how you submit your notes. What I recommend is having a list of names. So for example, Connor would have his name and then the notes that he included. Then Jamie, I don't remember who's on a team. Then Jamie would have her name and then a list of notes. And that way I can see if Connor has a ton of notes and a ton of research and Jamie doesn't have anything or just has 2 sentences, I can see who did more work and the grade will reflect it. Now, if you have a group that's working perfectly together, you don't have to divide it up, but I think that's a way to protect yourself. The other thing I'll say is because we're online, I'm not doing 1-minute recaps and show and tell today. Monday and Wednesday is a perfect time for 1-minute recaps of the last 2 days of class or show and tell. So take advantage of that. Okay, any questions before we get to the actual material? All right, cool. We have a decent amount to cover because this concept of sports washing is pretty important, and I am going to have you do an in-class writing related to it. So let's get right into it. So like I was saying, you don't have any required readings technically for next week, but you should start doing research and looking at the materials I provide. So every debate, what I do is I put together a folder of stuff that your team should pay attention to, and you just figure out who reads what. I also can't remember if I posted the teams on Brightspace already, but I will double check that I've posted so all you know who you're working with. All right, so last time we were talking about politics and the sacred divide. I want to briefly go over that, make sure we understand it, think a little bit about your examples of politicians using sports, and then we want to get into this concept of sports washing, which is a really key one. It's a really powerful example, and you can see it all around us. So I want to make sure we understand that, and that'll be a little bit more of a lecture. So when it comes to, oh, sorry, there's a siren in the back. I don't know if that it's affecting you hearing me. When we think about sports and politics, sociologists always say that sports is political, right? And when they're doing that, like I said last time, they're talking about politics in more of a cultural sense. They're talking about in regards to sex, in regards to gender, in regards to race, class, sexuality. But that's not how we actually use the term politics in our society. We're talking usually about what do governments do? What do politicians actually do? Now, the way that governments and politicians get to use sport is because they play off this idea that sports and politics are actually divided, right? That makes it a more powerful source for politicians, which is kind of this ironic thing. It's useful for politicians because we see sport as a space that's free from politics. So when we see all these examples of presidents, politicians, whether they're on the campaign trail, whether they're already elected, this is a picture of Jimmy Carter, president I didn't have up last time. Not usually thought to be one of the critiques of Jimmy Carter is that he had trouble connecting with the general populace. He wasn't thought of as the most masculine or athletic president. So he would do things like photo shoots, playing baseball, throwing a pitch, right, to try to make those connections. So last time we talked about what does a politician actually get from sport? Three things, right? And they're all pretty straightforward. We can see how this happens. First is just visibility, most straightforward of them. Second is you actually connect to people. If you can appear like an ordinary person, it's a way to make those kind of emotional connections, to resonate on a way that isn't simply saying, I'm going to lower taxes, or I'm going to fix infrastructure, or I'm going to provide healthcare, or I'm going to cut back Social Security or protect Social Security. Outside of that, allows you to be someone who can actually connect, because we know most politicians come from a very elite background. If we look at politicians' education, what schools they went to when they were young, what college they went to, how wealthy their parents were, politicians on average come from a very elite background, just in terms of their social status, right? So how do you connect to the population who's voting for you? Well, one of the ways is through sport. And then even more, the third thing, this is the most important, but the most difficult to measure, is you actually get some of those qualities from sport associated with you. If you played a sport when you were younger and you can talk about that as a politician, it's a way for people not only to connect with you, but they trust you and think you have the qualities that go with being an athlete, right? If you have those connections, it could be about you're appearing at the stadium. It's not just that you're connecting to people, but you're associated with that fun. Even if it's just subconsciously, you're associated with that energy, community, likability, hard work, excellence, all those things associated with sport. But again, it only works if the politician upholds that idea that there is a sacred divide. When they're seen as breaking that divide, then there's usually some sort of backlash because they're bringing politics into sports, right? That's when it actually gets criticized. Now, I asked you to come up and share your examples of this. This was what the in-class writing was. I didn't have a chance to read through all of them. But what I asked you to do was think about, okay, so what is the politician doing? Is it effective? What are the different qualities? This is something that you can think about and draw on in the debate next week. This could be part of your story. Does anyone want to share an example or two? Let's just get like 2 examples and then I want to go forward. I'm curious what stuff you found. Anyone just jump in. I just want to hear 2. Like, what did you search and what did you find? Who's willing to share? Raise your hand if you want, but or just type into the chat like what the example was. I'm curious. Let's get at least 2 before we go forward.
I can share.
Okay, what did you get, Lindsay?
So basically, I just wrote about how Donald Trump and his wife attended the 2020 NCAA football playoff national championship game between LSU and Clemson. And basically, he just like received a really big standing ovation. Everyone cheered for him when him and his wife walked on the field. The whole crowd was chanting like USA and 4 more years. And they both stood on the field for the national anthem, and then they were also cheered for as they walked off. Yeah, that was my example.
Yeah, so really classic example of a politician using sport. Now, Trump was an interesting example, and we can come back to this. Actually, we'll come back to that one in just a tiny bit. That's a really interesting one. We'll contrast Trump and Biden and their relationship to sport. Let's get another example. One more before we go on.
I was gonna say Trump at the UFC fights.
Okay, so we got 2 Trump ones. Tell me about that one.
He would go to the UFC fights, and not just one, like he had a huge influence on the UFC fights, and not only just in that matter, but like politically too. Like he tried to I'm sorry, my brain's not working.
No, this is really good. And let me actually take this example and we'll go to the next thing. So here's what's interesting, right? We talked about, and someone jump in. What did I just say for how generally, if we look historically at politicians and their use of sport, right? The French president appearing at the World Cup final when France was going against Argentina, right? They appear before the game. You see all these images of them in the press box, and they appear as a fan, right? So what is it that I just said that a politician traditionally has to maintain to get the benefit from being associated with sport? Someone help me out. What was that word I've been using over and over, or you can just put in your own terms? What illusion do they have to maintain, or what cultural idea do they have to uphold?
That they like connect with people on a level that's like you can go and have a beer with them. So like
That's what
you're
that's right. That's what they get from it. But how do they, what do they have to, what illusion do they have to uphold their cultural idea to get that benefit? What it has to appear like what? That they're doing it because they like
a
it,
normal
right?
person.
That's the benefit, but what they have to maintain to get that is this idea of the sacred divide. This is the key concept. They have to maintain the idea that the sport itself is not political. Oh yeah, Julie, Julie, you have the right answer in the chat. They have to let me just close up. They have to keep this idea that what they're doing is for the love of the game. They're an ordinary person because they also like the sport. The French president, his heart also goes up when the French team scores, and it goes down when they lose, right? It's not because he's making a political appearance. Trump appearing at the UFC was interesting because there was a huge debate among people who were there about whether he was cheered for or booed at. Now, in reality, it was both. Some people at the event booed him, some people cheered him. When he went to the football game, it was generally a positive response. He appeared at a Major League World Series game, and there was a lot of booing, right? So this became this contentious, he had a very contentious relationship with sport. Part of the reason he had such a contentious relationship with sport was that he was willing to bring politics into the sporting world. He began to use sport as a political symbol. So one of the things that I would like some people to do, if any of you are looking for a show and tell, normally we don't go back in time, but this is a really useful thing to look at. Trump had some very well covered back and forths with talking about Colin Kaepernick when Kaepernick was kneeling and then out of the NFL. He had a back and forth with LeBron James. He had a back and forth with Steph Curry. He was someone who rescinded invites to the White House. Now, again, there was a debate. So when the Warriors won, he said he would not invite them, but they said, well, we already said we wouldn't go, right? So he treated sport as this place that could also be politicized, criticizing some players and not other players. When he was on the campaign trail, bringing up players at rallies and saying, these players need to respect the country. These players are too entitled. So if any of you want to do a show and tell and look at these specific cases, these would all be really useful things that we could think through. He was the only president that directly said, I will break down this sacred divide. Sport is also political space. Now, he attempted at some points to recover it, right? So he appeared at UFC events. He brought Colby Covington into the White House, but he brought Colby Covington into the White House after Colby Covington said a number of specifically political things in support of Trump, right? So we could look at how this is a case where the sacred divide is eroded. There's tension between him and a number of athletes. So if anyone wants to do a show and tell, email me. This would be a really, really useful thing to look at. Now, it was also interesting because during this time, we're also seeing athletes be more political as well, bringing politics into sport, using their platforms. That's something that we'll cover at the end of the semester. That's the final thing that we discuss. But in terms of politicians, specifically treating sports as political, Trump is the clearest example. Every politician does it, but he didn't hide it, right? So he did it in a more overt way. Then we see Biden elected. Biden has, in a sense, returned to a more traditional approach, right? He started bringing teams into the White House that had not appeared. No NBA team went to the White House when Trump was president. As soon as Biden's president, we see the Milwaukee Bucks and then the Golden State Warriors. We see the classic things of jerseys being exchanged. I believe some NHL teams went during Trump's years and some did not. That would be another interesting thing to look up. Same with football. But already we had seen this become politicized, so it's hard to simply return it. When Biden invited the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who's the quarterback of the Bucks, or was till he just retired?
Tom Brady.
Tom Brady, friends with Donald Trump, right? And Brady is someone who said Tom Brady is someone who said they did not want to be political, but he's someone who was also friends with Trump. And there was a big question whether he would go to the White House when Biden was elected. He did, because it's not supposed to be a political act. And since they were trying to return the sacred divide. So that's something, again, in terms of show and tells, look at some of the relationships between athletes and presidents, bring in some of those stories. You could also see when Hank Aaron died, famous baseball player, Joe Biden puts out a statement at the White House. Really classic example of how politicians use sports, right? We can start to read this. We won't read the whole thing. I only cut and pasted the first half. But when I watched Henry Aaron play baseball, I knew I was watching someone special. It wasn't just about watching a gifted athlete master his craft on the way to the Hall of Fame career as one of the greatest to play the game. It was that each time Henry Aaron rounded the bases, he wasn't just chasing a record. He was helping us chase a better version of ourselves. Look at this classic thing he's doing at a politician. He's showing he's a fan. He's talking about, I'm an ordinary person too. I grew up watching athletes. It was exciting. But also, it teaches us something better. It teaches us to be better people. Trying to get that osmosis, trying to get that connection between, we all celebrate the athletes. Now let's connect that to something bigger. Connect it to my vision of what the country should be. He continues to do it. With courage and dignity eclipsed the most hallowed record in sports while absorbing vengeance that would have broken most people. But he was unbreakable. He stemmed the vicious forces of white supremacy and death threats, hate mail, and hardened hearts. What I deeply admired and respected about him is that each time he rounded those bases, an astonishing 755 trips home, he melted away more and more of the ice of bigotry to show that we can be better as people in a nation. And he continues on. This is the classic use of sports and politics. Keeping that divide, I'm not making sports political, but I'm showing how it can inspire us. This is also an example of the dramaturgical model. Biden is saying that this is the story that Hank Aaron was demonstrating, that there was something bigger than just running from base to base, that it meant something more significant. All right, so I'm going to go on because I want to take 30 minutes for sport washing. But next week on Monday, come to class prepared to start working on the debate. But also, if you have questions about this idea of the sacred divide, I want to make sure we understand it, because we'll return to this over and over and over. So come with questions. It'll be either easier to have a conversation in person to make sure we all understand this stuff. The other thing is, we haven't had a quiz for a while in class. We'll probably have one on Wednesday. So next week is devoted to working on the debates, but we'll also probably have a really short quiz on this type of stuff, on sports washing, on the sacred divide. So Monday will be the chance to make sure we all understand everything. Okay, let's get to sports washing. So you all should have listened to a podcast on this. Right at the beginning of the podcast, they provided a bit of a definition. And there was conversation throughout the rest of the 30-minute podcast about what sports washing is, what are some examples of it, what's the significance. So what I want to do to start out is simply, and this is going to count as an in-class writing, is I want you to come up with a definition of sports washing. Doesn't have to be great, and just put it in the chat. So think back to the podcast. If you want to even do a Google search now, fine. If you want to just cut and paste something, I'd rather put in your own words, but put it in the chat. I want to see what you come up with, and this will count towards in-class writing. So after we're done with class, I'm just going to skim through, see you put answers in the chat, and you're all going to get credit for it. So start telling me, start now. I'm just making, what definitions what would you say sports washing is? 1 to 2 sentences. Doesn't have to be that eloquent or brilliant a definition, but just like, what do you think sports washing is about based on the podcast? And then I'll give you my definition, and I'm going to lecture for the last 25 minutes, see how far we can get with understanding. Carlos is a pretty good start. All right, take 2 more minutes. We're getting some good answers. Almost everyone's agreeing. The only difference is who's actually doing the sports washing. That seems the biggest. There's some variation there. All right, can you see my screen again? Someone let me know. You can all see my definition?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so here's my definition. A little bit more technical, but it's basically saying what a lot of you are saying. It's a phenomena whereby political leaders use sports to appear important or legitimate on a world stage. So this is getting a little bit more specific, thinking about what it actually does. So the key aspects, I think, are to demonstrate either the importance, the power, or to make it legitimate, accepted. And we'll think about why that's so important. Those are two different things. They're related, but they're different. So it's to appear important or legitimate on the world stage. That's the other thing that's key. It can happen on the smaller scale, right? You could say that politicians are always doing this on the small scale with the type of appearances, those type of things. What was one of the first things that the governor of New York did when she was elected? It's related to a football team not far from here. What was one of the first things she announced? Anyone jump in? This would be a good show and tell also. Who's the most popular sports team in Western New York?
The Buffalo Bills.
Okay, so what was the first thing she did?
Bills. Wait, what was your question?
What's the first thing the governor of New York did when she was elected? What's one of the first things she
Build a
announced?
new stadium.
She said that she's going to help fund a new stadium, right? So we could say in a way that's kind of sports washing, but really it's more just a politician's classic use. And we'll talk about the funding of stadiums that's in the second debate. But sports washing is usually on a bigger scale. It should be more national, or at least regional in the sense of multiple countries involved, right? So sports washing, it's political leaders using sports to appear important and legitimate on a world stage while stoking nationalism, right? So it encourages the population to rally behind the politician. And then what a lot of you are pointing out, it deflects attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes on the home front. This is what sports washing does. This is the big thing. There's a bunch of stuff happening here. So it's when you're doing it, these sports washers, these politicians, these government agencies, they're using mega events to try to get national prestige and to convey a strong economy or political stance. Now, the other thing that's really key, and this is often forgotten, it's sports washing can emerge in both authoritarian countries and democratic countries. So oftentimes our attention goes towards places like Qatar or Dubai, where it's more of a, or Saudi Arabia, where there's this authoritarian leader, or we're looking at Russia, right? There's an authoritarian leader who is using sports, but democratic countries are doing it too. We'll talk about London. We could talk about the United States. It's all types of countries are engaging in sports washing. And it brings together, oh yeah, sorry, who was jumping in?
Sorry. I was gonna say, would an example of this be like during World War II when they used like the women to play baseball to like distract from the war?
Yeah, that could work. I need to think more about that example because I don't know enough about like what the motivation was or the context. But yeah, because it was designed to entertain and rally the population. It's hard because wasn't the audience more? It was simply domestic though, right? It was just people.
Yeah,
It was just
it was kind of meant to help the soldiers too. Like they would broadcast it to the soldiers and to the country to fill the hole where
yeah.
all the because the men got shipped off to
Yeah,
to
so
war.
that wouldn't be sports washing as much. That would be more kind of just using it. It would still be about using entertainment and providing and like raising morale. But the key part here is that the competition is international too, right? So you're televising like all the different countries are seeing this thing occur. And I'll give some examples in a little bit. But that would be more, it has to be some sort of international aspect to it, right? For
Okay.
sports washing. So it's a democratic. So we'll talk about when London hosted the Olympics, it was still to show the power of the country. And when London got the Olympics, the political leaders said, hey, we're going to bring home the most gold. It wasn't going to happen, but it raises that degree of nationalism as everyone gets excited and rallies behind being from the UK. But it's that international aspect's really key to this. So you could see the power of sports with your example, but it wouldn't be sports washing to the same degree. So it can be used to distract. It is used. Part of it is that it's used to distract, right? So when you have a mega event, it distracts the public from things like homelessness, things like increased policing, things like human rights violations. For instance, in the buildup to Los Angeles is going to host the 2028 Olympics. One of the things that they're going to do is try to clean up the homeless population. It's not solving homelessness, but it's just making sure that people can't see it, right? This was the story in the podcast. Kareem Zidane talks about visiting the people visiting the Soviet Union and saying, oh, it doesn't seem like what I imagined, right? Because all those things are hidden away. So you change people's impression of what the country actually is. Okay, so
Is it
yeah.
Sorry, is it like, like with the recent World Cup that went on and anyone who supported it, like David Beckham Jr., they
Mhm.
kind of got backlash because of the Qatar, and you said the leader's a dictator, and they were saying like human violated out there.
Exactly. So yeah, we'll use that. We're going to use that as the main example. If you look at the readings for the debate, all of them are based around the World Cup. That's one of the clearest examples of it because A, you have an authoritarian government. B, you have a ton of very clear human rights violations, which you'll be reading about. C, it's the biggest world stage, right? There's more attention, there's more sustained attention around the World Cup than there is the Olympics or the Super Bowl. So it's the biggest stage. And then D, you have athletes actually trying to raise attention for these type of things, and they're being silenced. So you could say, why would a country build all these types of event? Why would they put so much money into building venues for soccer to take place, right? Why would they bring in labor from across the border and have them build new stadiums that probably won't be used again? Why is it worth it? Well, the way we understand it is sports washing. They're trying to appear. What are the two things that it does? It makes the government appear important, right? Because now a lot of you have heard of a country that most of you probably had not paid much attention to before. So it makes it seem like they're a world player. They're hosting a global event that normally could go to a place like Brazil or go to a place like France or go to a place like the United States. So they're on the same level as these other countries. So they seem important. And then the other thing is it makes them seem legitimate because you're like, well, all right, so I've heard about some issues over there, whether maybe it's the rights that the lack of rights that the gay population has. Maybe it's the lack of rights that some women have in that area. I've heard about that stuff, but they're doing this thing that is a global event, so it helps build their legitimacy. So that's a perfect example of sports washing. Now, the term itself is relatively new, right? The term only goes back to 2015. It became it first started being used as a word. It started being part of our lexicon or our language ahead of the European Games in Azerbaijan. This is a country that was engaged in the Middle East, and there were a lot of human rights violations. So you have Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, kind of the two biggest international groups that pay attention to human rights violations. And they're both saying, hey, there's a lot of really awful things happening in this country. There's a dictator whose name was Ilham Aliyev, and he's using this as a way to distract from their human rights record by having this prestigious event, right? This is why they're doing it. So immediately, sports washing became this term that we saw being used over and over and over, right? And suddenly you saw Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch paying attention to this type of stuff. This is an example of what's called soft power, right? Political scientists love to use this term soft power. They draw the contrast between soft power and hard power when it's about having international influence. How do you impact other countries? Well, hard power, what do you think hard power refers to? There's two examples of hard power. If one country wants to influence another country, change their policies, change who the leaders are, what do you think the hard power is? Both of these occurred when Russia threatened to and then invaded Ukraine. We engaged in a type of hard power, one of the two types. So what are the types of hard power? And Russia invading Ukraine was an example of one type of hard power.
War.
War, military. One type of hard power is military. How do you impact a country, get them to change? One is through using your military force. What's another one? What's another thing that you can do if a country is doing something that we do not support or are threatened by? Economic sanctions in particular, right? So hard power is usually military force or economic sanctions. Soft power is trying to shape through co-option, right? Through trying to shape people's values and ideas rather than forcing or compelling them to do something with military threat or economic penalty. It's about this kind of non-material mode of influence. So you say soft power, it's often harder to measure. It's more difficult to wield, but it's about changing people's perception of the country, about building relationships that did not exist before. Sometimes it takes years to get the desired outcome, right? But sports washing is seen as one of the big examples, prime examples of soft power right now. There is a very long history of this, right? So the term itself only goes back to 2015, but there's a long, rich history of sports washing. You could go back to the ancient Olympics. In the podcast you listened to, Kareem Zidane talked about things that Egypt did. I often trace it back to the ancient Olympics. In the ancient Olympics in Greece was held as there was a war going on between Athens and Sparta. Athens entered numerous teams into the chariot race as a way of starting to build connections and show their might to the countries around them. That, in a sense, is a type of sports washing, right? A more modern example, and an important one, is the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Does anyone know, actually, this is a really interesting trivia question. Does anyone want to know where the torch ceremony came from? You know how the Olympics always start off with a torch being carried from Mount Olympus in Greece all the way to the host city. Does anyone know when that started? Or who came up with the idea? The answer is kind of right in front of you. I'm curious.
The first Olympics.
Nope, that's a really good guess. That's what
The
we're often.
1936 Olympics.
Yeah, that's you guessed both of the ones. 1936 Olympics. The person who came up with that idea was Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels was the propaganda minister for Adolf Hitler, for the Nazi Party. So in 1936, the Nazis invented a tradition to facilitate sports washing, the Olympic torch relay. So under the plan, you would have the torch lit at Mount Olympus, and then it would be brought all the way to Berlin, where it would light the torch to where the Olympics would be, right? So they would have over 3,000 runners. They would pass it back and forth. It was a way of showing the direct connection between Greece, that was seen as one of the foundations of civilization, with the Germans, who were presenting themselves as the Aryan race, as the true and worthy heirs of Western civilization. Right now, we don't really think about that history. That history is never talked about. The torch relay started in 1936. It continues into today, but that was an example of sports washing. It was saying we're going to carry through all these different countries in Europe, and as we do it, it would also, those people carrying the torches and the people facilitating the torch carrying would share Nazi propaganda, would talk about the power of the Germans, would talk about how all the runners were these strong, blonde, blue-eyed people, and they were supposed to be the examples of the Aryan race, the master race, according to Hitler. Then hosting the Olympics, if you look at some of the times, the coverage of the Olympics during that time, even from something like the New York Times, here's a quote. Olympic visitors from abroad would depart Germany with the impression that this is a nation happy and prosperous, almost beyond belief, that Hitler is one of the greatest, if not the greatest political leader in the world today, and that Germans themselves are much maligned, hospitable, and wholly peaceful people who deserve the best the world can give them. Another person in the New York Times commented that that the Germans are wonderful people and only seek to please those around them, right? So the games burnished Hitler's popularity. It reached the peak popularity both in the country and internationally during the Olympics. Let's see, Jaron just joined. But then just a year later, you start to see the Germans killing off the Jewish population as well as other populations. 2 years later, you see them start to occupy land around them. 3 years later, they invade Czechoslovakia, right? So, but first the sports washing occurred. It did the two things that we talked about, right? It legitimized the government. It presented a positive image to the world stage. It deflected attention from chronic social problems and human rights issues. The Nazis were starting to round up people to kill them. And it stoked nationalism, right? So this succeeded. The Berlin Olympics are a perfect example of this. But it didn't end there. There's tons of examples from more recent events. We could talk about the Beijing Olympics in 2008 in China. There were a ton of human rights violations. This was very clear, but you build this giant stadium, you show the power of the country. Why is it worth spending millions and millions of dollars to build a stadium like in the top? Or we have the Sochi Winter Olympics in Russia in 2014. Why is it worth doing that? Because A, it builds nationalist excitement, it rallies the population, but it shows your power. That's the reason it's worth spending this much money. That's why it's worth doing. And over, we see international organizations go along with it. We knew there were human rights violations in China in 2008, right? All those things were well known. But then what happened? Well, then a number of years later, you have massive events in China again, right? So it wasn't like it happened and then they were like, well, we're not going back here. We knew about the human rights violations in Qatar, and they host a ton of events. We know about the human rights violations in Russia, but yet over and over, these type of events are done. And again, why does the government invest in that? Because it is a way of showing power. Now with sports washing, I just put together this little chart. You could think about it goes multiple directions. So you have the activity occur in the center, and then, well, who are the actual people who see it? It's both for domestic audiences. It's about the general population. It's about showing power to political allies and adversaries. It's about giving opportunities to the elite business people, right? People with money. It's about boosting the domestic media who can take pride in the event and also boost numbers. And it's about having power with domestic cultural influencers. So that's who you're trying to reach domestically. And then when you think about internationally, who are the people who are being reached? It's about interacting with the global sports bodies, whether it's a group like FIFA with the World Cup, whether it's about the International Olympic Committee. It's about how the global media covers you, right? Because you bring all those reporters in and you say, look how beautiful our country is. It's about attracting the wealthy from abroad who would be able to invest. You bring people in and you give them a special box, and they get to feel important, and they get to meet with the politicians, and they get to meet with the domestic business elites. About building those connections. When people travel to Russia for a World Cup event or for an Olympic event, you're building that network. So you're affecting, it's about reaching all these different people. So again, it seems like a simple thing. You're hosting an event. Why are you doing it? Because of this. And then thinking about the different types, like I said before, it could be with an authoritarian government. It could be with a democratic government, right? There's examples of both of these things occurring. More and more, it's happening with authoritarian governments, right? And the reason is it costs a lot of money. So when you're thinking about hosting an event and you have a democratic country, a lot of the population potentially gets upset. They say, why are we spending so much money on this thing instead of schools, instead of healthcare? What are we actually behind this? So it's a lot harder with a democratic country. It still happens. We have the Olympics in London, right? We have the Olympics in Salt Lake City. We have the Olympics in Atlanta. Still happens over and over, but more and more you see major events being hosted by authoritarian governments who can choose how the money is used in their country without people being able to say no, and B, they're more interested in showing off their power, and C, they're more interested in appearing legitimate because they're trying to get respect on the international stage. Other examples of soft power. So far we've talked about countries hosting events on their own soil, right? The Olympics, the World Cup, those type of events. It can also happen in other ways. You could take the show on a road in a sense, right? So last time I showed you this picture, China has done this over and over where they use stadiums as a form of diplomacy. How do you get your influence in a country? You say, well, hey, Costa Rica, you're a smaller country. You're in the Western Hemisphere. You're not that far from the United States. We want to expand our influence. What do? What's this a picture of? Not a trick. What is this a picture of? What do you think that building's used for?
Stadium.
Sports stadium. So what do? You say, hey, Costa Rica, we're willing to build you a sports stadium. We'll help do this for you. And so that gives not only the politicians in the area a favorable impression of you, it gives the general population who gets to use this thing. And every time they go to an event, every time they play at an event, they say, hey, this was a gift from China. Right? So you do that throughout the Caribbean. You do that through the West Indies. We see it happening in another way. A lot of Saudi Arabia, wealthy people from Saudi Arabia and the government itself from Saudi Arabia is buying all types of teams, buying a team in the Premier League soccer, hosting events. Well, actually, this is going back to hosting events on the soil, but hosting motorsports, boxing, soccer, tennis, right? Bringing people's attention to what is happening on the soil itself. Or if the other thing that's occurring is looking to buy teams. The NBA is on the verge of shifting their policy where now international conglomerations can invest in NBA teams. The next time an NBA team goes up for sale, we can be sure that investors from Saudi Arabia or Qatar or somewhere in the Middle East are going to be trying to make that purchase. Why? Because you buy a fan base, right? You start to show yourself as legitimate, ordinary people, right? Not ordinary, but you start to connect with that population. The example I asked you to look up for today was the Live Golf League. What's the deal with the Live Golf League?
They pay people a lot.
They pay people a ton. Where's the money coming from?
Saudi Arabia people.
All right, so you got Saudi Arabia. They're starting a golf league. They're going to be paying the golfers a ton of money. There's going to be a smaller number of golfers, but they're all guaranteed. Right. The thing about the traditional golf, who follows golf in here? Does anyone follow the PGA at all?
I do.
Okay, so you follow the PGA. How do you actually get into the event? What happens before the event? Does every big name always make it?
You got to qualify or get invited.
You got to qualify or get invited, right? So oftentimes you have people compete, a big name, and it's a question of, will Tiger Woods actually make the cut, right? Biggest name, but doesn't always actually make it into the tournament. Now, Liv says, we're going to do something different. We're going to guarantee that you are going to be in the tournament and you're going to make a lot of money. So we're going to pay you more than the PGA. PGA, in a sense, has had a monopoly on this type of thing. So Liv comes along, the International Golf League. It's funded by Saudi Arabia, and they say we're going to have all these events, and there's controversy around it because where's the money coming from? Also, they're only poaching the big name golfers, so it changes the nature. One of the things that people like about golf is it works as more of a meritocracy. If anyone gets on that course and they score and they have a good run on the course, they can participate in the tournament. Instead, Liv is saying we're just going to lure those big name golfers away, like Dustin Johnson, like Phil Mickelson, and we're going to have them compete, and we're going to guarantee they make a ton of money. Liv knows that it's going to be losing money on this, right? It's going to be many years before they'll be able to see a single cent from this of a profit. They're not doing it for the profit. They're doing it for the connection to this traditionally Western sport that's popular among the elite. Now, when Phil Mickelson was asked about this, did any of you see this controversy? when Phil Mickelson said why he was going over to live? You don't have to tell me what it is. Just tell me if you've heard about it. I'm just kind of curious how much attention it got.
I read about it a
did.
little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So this was last year. Phil Mickelson's being interviewed about the decision to go to live and demand his release from the PGA Tour. Phil Mickelson, one of the great golfers historically. And he says, this is his quote. "We know they killed Khashoggi. Now, Khashoggi is a Washington Post reporter and a U.S. resident, and he was murdered by the Saudi Arabian government." And he's saying, hey, we know that, because he was basically saying negative things about the Saudi Arabian government, and then he got killed. And he says, hey, we know they killed Khashoggi, and they have a horrible human rights, and they have a horrible record in human rights. He continued, they execute people over there for being gay. Knowing all this, why would I even consider it? Because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to reshape how the PGA Tour operates. They've been able to get by with manipulative, coercive, strong arm tactics because we, the players, had no recourse. So he is effectively saying, I know they murdered a journalist. I know they kill people for being gay. Why would I consider it? Because I don't like how the PGA pays its players, right? This received a lot of backlash. Next class, we're going to pick up thinking about why that received backlash, what the backlash actually shows. And then I'm going to give you 4 concluding thoughts on how sports washing works. So this is where we're going to end today. For next time, start thinking about the debate. Start looking at some of the resources I have. Look over what we've talked about so far. What's confusing about the sacred divide? What's confusing about sports washing? I'll get you in your groups. We'll talk a little bit more about this stuff. Then you'll have time to meet. And then Wednesday we'll have a quiz, and then Friday the actual debate. So that is the plan. And that is the end of class. So stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, I will see you in person on Monday.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend.